Okay, so next concept is client libraries. Client libraries. So client library also a node in JCR repository. A node in JCR repository. So it is similar to your AEM component. Let's say if you want to create any component, we have to create a node with seq equivalent component node time. Similarly, if you want to create a client library, you have to create a node called seq equivalent client library folder. Seq equivalent client library folder is a JCR primary type in order to create the client library. What is the purpose of this client library? So these client libraries can be used to manage client-side libraries like CSS and JavaScript and font files and small images like icon-related images we can manage by using this client library. So here the client library name is not important. We can use any name. So the name is not important, but the node type is important. So in this case, I have used client lib-desktop is a node name, but the node type is CQ client library folder. The node type must be CQ client library folder. CQ client library folder. So in our JCR, in our CRXDE, the client libs will create under client libs folder. So there is a dedicated folder under news portal. In this folder, we have to create the client libraries. But this is not mandatory, but recommended. Even we can create the client libraries outside of the client libs also. Even we can create client library anywhere in JCR repository. Anywhere in JCR repository, not only under apps, news portal, client libs. You can create anywhere in JCR repository. But this is the place to recommend to create all your client libraries. Rather than creating client libraries in different places, place all your client libraries under apps, news portal, client libs folder in JCR repository. The node type is CQ colon client library folder and node name it could be anywhere. But while creating the client library, it is recommended to start with the client lib. Client lib. So the reason to start with the client lib is by seeing this name, we can identify this is a client library. Without seeing this JCR primary type, we can easily identify the type of the folder, client lib-desktop. So by seeing this name, we can easily identify this is a client library. This is a client library. So once you create a client library by using seq equivalent client library folder, inside the client library, we have to create js.txt and css.txt. js.txt and css.txt. You can use both or at least one .txt file is required. If you want to use this client library to manage both CSS and JavaScript, then css.txt and js.txt we have to create. So both are required in order to manage both CSS and JavaScript files. Let's say if you want to manage only the JavaScript in this client library, js.txt is enough. So here js.txt is index file. Index file. In this index file, we have to mention all the JavaScript file names. All the JavaScript file names we have to mention. We have to mention in js.txt. This is an index file. And this is not a source. The js.txt contains all the JavaScript files which is available in this client library. And there is one more folder called JS. This is optional folder. Within the JS folder, even outside of the JS folder also, we can create the JavaScript files. We can create the JavaScript file, but recommended to create one JavaScript folder within the client library and place all the JavaScript files. So here article-info.js, product-info.js, and payments.js, all are JavaScript files. And these file names we have to mention in js.txt. So this step is very important. This step is very important. We have to mention all the JavaScript file names in js.txt. In js.txt. Let's say if you create 3 different JavaScript files and place different JavaScript code inside these JavaScript files, and then mention the file names in js.txt. If you mention these JavaScript file names in the js.txt, in the runtime, all the JavaScript files will merge, generate a single file. All these three JavaScript files will merge and generate a single JavaScript file with the name of the client library. Here, the client library name is client-lib-desktop. It will generate one final output JavaScript file by combining all the JavaScripts of the client library. The same thing will repeat for the CSS files also. In order to manage the CSS, create css.txt and create CSS folder. Inside CSS folder, create multiple CSS files with the implementation. In the runtime, all the CSS files will be merged and generate a single file with the name of the client library. With the name of the client library. Advantage with this approach, it will reduce the number of requests for JavaScript and CSS. Let's say if you don't have the client library, we have to include JS file like article info.js file and product info.js file and payment.js file in the HTML markup. Now we don't need to include three different JavaScript files. Include only client-lib-desktop.javascript file. And this file contains all the implementation of these three files. This file contains all the implementation of these three files because in the runtime, these three files will be merged and generate a single file with the name of the client library. With the name of the client library. Let's execute these steps in CRXD. Go to apps, news portal, and client libs. Client libs. So there is an existing client library is already available. Client lib-base, client lib-dependencies, client lib-grid, client lib-site. Click on any one of the existing client library and check the properties. Check the property. The property, the node type is seq-equivalent client library folder. Click on any one of the client library and check the JSON primary type. The type must be seq-equivalent client library folder. Seq-equivalent client library folder. So let's create our own client library by right-clicking client libs, create node. It is similar to component creation, but while creating the client library, here we have to select seq-equivalent client library folder as a node type. It must be seq-equivalent client library. If you create a normal folder, it won't work. You must select a seq-equivalent client library folder as a node type. And node name, it could be any value. Client lib-desktop is the node name. And click on node. And save the changes. Control S or click on save all button. Save the changes. So we have successfully created a client library. Client library name is client lib-desktop. Inside this folder, create js.txt file and css.txt file. css.txt file. Based on the requirement, we have to create these files. Let's say if you want to manage both JavaScript and CSS files, both JavaScript and CSS file, these two files are required. Let's say if you want to manage only the JavaScript, create js.txt. Only CSS, create css.txt file. Based on the requirement, we have to create either css.txt or js.txt or both. And let's create one folder to manage JavaScript files and create one more folder for CSS and create a sample JavaScript files inside the JS folder. Inside the JS folder, create a sample JavaScript files, article-info.js. For testing purpose, I'm adding one JavaScript variable. save, and creating one more file, payments.js file or product.js file. Similarly, we can create n number of JavaScript files. There is no limit here. So based on your requirement, we can create n number of JavaScript files. I'm writing some dummy function for testing purpose. Authority. Save the changes. Save the changes. So this is a simple implementation. Simple implementation for the JavaScript. JavaScript. Now try to access client-lib-desktop.java file. Sorry, JavaScript file. So this is the path. This is the location of the client library. Now copy this path, localhost 4502, and paste the path and .js file. Click on enter. It is returning empty, but in this JavaScript, in this client library, we have the JavaScript files, but those data is not returning. It is returning always empty. So always empty. So the reason is when you try to access this with this URL, first it will go to the client library based on this URI. So this is the first step. In the JCR repository, it will go to the client library. And you are accessing .js, right? It will check js.txt file. So this is the second step. In the second step, in this client library, it will check for js.txt. If in case this file is not available, it will return 404. It will return 404 if in case js.txt is not available in this client library. Let's say the file is available. File is available. It will merge all the JavaScript files. It will merge all the JavaScript files which is mentioned in js.txt and generate the client-lib-desktop.js. Now this client-lib-desktop.js returning empty because we did not mention JavaScript file names in js.txt. If you forgot to mention the JavaScript file names in js.txt, it won't render into the final output. In this final output file, you can't see that JavaScript implementation. So this is a mandatory step. You have to index all your JavaScript file names in js.txt file. In js.txt file. Go to js.txt. JS is a folder. Inside JS folder, article-info.js. JS is folder and main.js. JS is folder and payments.js file. Save the changes and refresh client-lib-desktop.js file. See, you can see the implementation of article-info.js file. The first statement is added in article-info.js file. And this is the method we have added in main.javascript file. And this is the one we have added in payments.javascript file. All three JavaScript files are combined, means merged, and generated final output with the name of the client library folder, client-lib-desktop.js. So these are the three important steps while executing the client library. If you try to access any JavaScript file with this path, first it will go to the client library based on this path, apps, news portal, client-lib-desktop.js. Then immediately read js.txt because we are trying to access .js file. It will read js.txt. If the js.txt is not available, it will return 404 error. It will return 404 error. And if the js.txt is available, It will read the data inside the js.txt and identify the JavaScript files and combine all the JavaScript files and generate a single file with the name of the client library. The steps are same for CSS also. The steps are same for CSS also. If we try to access .css files, .css file, in the first step, it will identify the client library in the JSR repository. In the second step, it will read css.txt and combine all the CSS files which is mentioned in css.txt and generate client library one desktop.css file. Desktop.css file. So we can use single client library to manage both JavaScript and CSS. Both JavaScript and CSS. I'm not adding any CSS files here. Let me add one simple CSS file for the testing purpose. Article info.css. Even the file names are not important. Article title. Font size 24 pixel and color red. Save the changes. This article info.css. Save it. Now try to access the CSS file, the same path. Sorry, this is the wrong location. CSS. So we have only one file. That file data is displaying here. That file data is displaying here. But rather than using JS prefix for each and every entry, we can define one base directory. So this is also valid but not recommended. Define one base directory, base equal to JS, and then remove this prefix. Remove this prefix. So this is the recommended one. So while executing this js.txt file, first it will identify the base directory within the client library. Base equal to JavaScript means JS. It will check the client library. Under the client library, it will identify the JS folder. Inside the JS folder, it will try to identify all the JS files. If any one of the JavaScript file is not available, it will not return any error. It will simply skip and execute the next one. Let's say I'm adding ps.js file, but this file is not available. It won't return any error. If the file is not available, it will simply skip the statement and execute the next statement. So what is the advantage of this approach? In normal HTML implementation, we can include the JavaScript files and CSS file by using this HTML tags. Let's say if you want to include the CSS file, link is the HTML element. By using the link HTML element, we can include the CSS. Script is one more HTML element to include or to load the JavaScript files. Because in order to consume the CSS and JavaScript, we have to include the CSS files and JavaScript files inside the HTML markup. So if you simply create the JavaScript files and CSS files, it won't impact into the HTML file. We have to load the CSS files and JavaScript files into the HTML markup, either head section or body section. In the HTML, there are two important sections. One is head section and second one is body section. In the head section, we have to load all the required CSS files. In the body section, by end of the body, we have to load all the required JavaScript files. That is the recommended approach to load the CSS and JavaScript files. In the head section, we should always load the CSS files. By end of the body, we have to load JavaScript files. So this is the HTML syntax to load the required CSS and JavaScript files. We have generated CSS files and JavaScript file by using the client library. Then how to include this client library specific CSS and HTML into our article pages? Into our article pages. So this is our article page, right? Article1.html. Click on page information and view as published. Go to view as published so that all the edit related behavior will be removed. Only plain HTML of article 1 would be available in view as admin. But view as published. This is the view as published. This is the view as published. And see the source code. See the source code and search with client-lib-desktop. Client-lib-desktop. Client-lib-desktop related CSS or JavaScript files are not loading into this HTML markup. If you don't load the HTML CSS, there is no use of creation. By default, it won't include it in all HTML markup. We have to include these client libraries into the HTML markup. As of now, client-lib-desktop is not loading into article pages. Not loading into article pages. And search with .css files, only 3 CSS files are loading. One is client-lib-base. And second one is client-lib-dependencies and client-lib-sites. So these 3 client libraries are already available and included in article1.html file. And similarly, we have to load our client library in our HTML markup. In our HTML markup, that is the next step. That is the next step. Once you create a client library, we have to load that client library into HTML markup in order to apply, in order to execute the CSS and JavaScript files. But there is one mandatory property. There is one mandatory property we have to add in order to load your client libraries into the HTML markup. That is categories. Categories is a mandatory property in order to consume these client libraries into HTML markup. For every client library, this property is required. And it required one value also, newsportal.desktop. And these names are not fixed. It could be any value, newsportal.desktop or newsportal article, it could be any value. So then here the value is not important, means value name is not important. So this property is very important. Remember this value, because whenever you want to include this client library, we have to use this category name only, category value only. So we don't use this client library folder name. So here the folder name is not important. It could be any value, but this categories value is important. So this categories value is an identifier to identify this client library. Without this identifier, we can't identify this client library. So it is similar to our names. Similar to our names. So without the name, we can't call a particular person. Let's say 10 members are standing outside. If you want to call a particular person, name is required. So the name is identifier to identify a particular person. Similarly, here categories is a property. This value is an identifier. This value is an identifier to identify this client library. And without this identifier, we can't consume this client library into HTML markups. Let's add this property. You can simply copy paste from other client libraries also. Click on client-lib-base. Client-lib-base. See, categories properties available here. Value type is multi-value. One person will have the multiple name. Similarly, client libs also will have the multiple names. You can simply copy paste the property and make the required changes in the value. Copy the property, paste in client-lib-desktop, paste, save the changes, and click on the value to modify. Newsportal.desktop is the value. This is the category value. Remember this value. So this is an identifier to identify this client library. This is an identifier to identify the client. We can load these client libraries into HTML markup in two ways. One is by using template policy, and second one is by using HTML code base. By using two ways, we can load these client libraries into HTML markup. First approach is template policy. And second approach is HTML code base. Let's discuss the first approach. At the time of the HTML concept, I will cover how to load the client library by using this HTML code base. But there are two different approaches to load the client libraries into HTML. First one is template policy. Second one is HTML code base. Now go to article 1 and go to template policy, means template editor. Let's say if you create 20 pages by using article template, go to any one of the page, click on this page information, click on edit template. Click on edit template. So this is the shortcut to navigate to template editor, or else go to start script, tools, general, and click on templates and select the project and identify the template and click on edit. So that is a lengthy process. Or else click on edit template, directly it will open template editor. Check this URL, localhost 4502, editor.html, and conf, news portal, settings, WCM, templates, article templates. Article 1 is the page. So that page is created by using this template. And structure.html. This is the template editor console. Go to this console and click on this page information tab and click on page policy. Click on page policy. And scroll down. So here we have an option called client libraries. We can load from here. See, the category names are displaying or auto-populating here. From this drop-down, you can select. So this is not a drop-down. So this is a suggested value. News portal.desktop is a category name. Category value we have given for client web and desktop. And click on done button. So while clicking the done button, we have to give the policy name. The policy name is, for example, article design or any name. Save button. So we have updated template policy, template page policy, and loading client link web and desktop, client link dot desktop. Our category name is, folder name is client link web and desktop, category name is news portal dot desktop. So we are loading this client level at template level. When you load this client library at template level, it will reflect in all pages. If you open any one of the article page, either article 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, open the source code. Now we'll see the include of the JavaScript and CSS files. News portal desktop.css and .javascript files will be available in the source. View the page source. Search with the desktop. See, this is one include. This is one include. Include for CSS file. And search with JavaScript. And this is one more include for JavaScript. So two different statements are added to load the JavaScript and CSS files. Link is HTML element to load the CSS file. Check the CSS file name. Apps, news portal, client libs, client lib open desktop is the location of our client libraries in JCR recorder. And then one unique ID is added. This ID is called version ID. Version ID. So this ID will change whenever you make the changes in the client library. Now go to news portal, client lib open desktop and make the changes either in CSS file or JavaScript file. Automatically this ID will change. This is one unique ID. It will auto-populate whenever you make the changes in the client library. So this ID is called version ID. Version ID. Dot min is one extension for the minification. Minification is one of the default feature in AEM client library. It will minify the entire the CSS file. Means it will compress. It will compress the entire the CSS file. So let's say the CSS file size is 100 KB without minification. After minification, it will be like 30 KB. Almost 60% of the size we can decrease. So this is also one of the powerful feature in AE. Automatically, it will compress or minify the CSS files and JavaScript files. Minification is the default behavior, but we can enable and disable this minification at any time from the system console configuration manager. System console configuration manager. Let's say if you want to stop minification, let me open the CSS JavaScript files. See, this is the minified JavaScript file. Minified JavaScript file. And access without minification. Just remove the min and this version ID and access the JS file. See, this is without minification and this is with minification. This is with minification. You can see the difference between with minification and without minification. Basically, the advantage with this minification, it will reduce the file size. If the file size is less, browser can easily download from server to browser and it can easily execute it. If the file size is huge or large, it will take a lot of time to download the JavaScript files and CSS file from server to browser. Even it will take a lot of time to process it. To improve the page speed or page performance, we have to enable the minification for CSS and JavaScript files. CSS and JavaScript file. Let's say if you want to stop this minification, go to System Console Configuration Manager. First go to System Console. And click on OSGI and click on configuration. It's loading. And search with HTML library manager, Control F, HTML library manager. Yeah, this is the one. Click on OK and check here versioning is enabled and even minification also enabled. Minification also enabled. We can uncheck and save the changes. So in this server, it will stop the minify the CSS files and JavaScript files. And versioning also we can enable and disable. So this versioning will be useful to cache the content at browser level. So rather than downloading each and every time CSS files and JavaScript files, if you are using this versioning, it will be cached at least 5 minutes. Let's say if you access the website, initially it will download all the required CSS files and JavaScript files and store in the browser. The next request within the 5 minutes, it won't load again. It will load from the browser cache. To save the time or to improve the page speed, this versioning will be useful. Versioning and minification. These are the default features of AEM. We have to make it enable by default in the remote servers, but it is but it is optional in the local servers. Okay, so this is the simple CSS file, right? CSS file, even CSS file also loading, but the CSS is not applying because we did not use the CSS class name anywhere. Let's use the CSS class name and check whether the CSS is applying for that article title or not. Go to article details, article detail.html. Here use h1 class equal article title. Save the changes. So this is the CSS class name we are referring here. The source code of the CSS class would be available in the CSS file. The CSS file is already loading in article pages. Let's refresh it. See, the CSS is applied. Inspect element. Inspect element. H1 class equal to article title. Go to the styles. So this is the styles we have added. Font size 24 pixel and color is red. And this CSS class is loading from the CSS file. Apps, news portal, client lib open desktop dot CSS. This is a client library. We are loading from the template level page policy. When you apply from the template level page policy, it will reflect in all pages, all article pages. This is the simple example. Basically, your front-end team will provide the required CSS files and JavaScript files will load into the client libraries. Will load into the client libraries, and those CSS classes we'll use in our HTML markup. But if you observe the remaining CSS include or JavaScript includes, CSS includes or JavaScript includes. Just compare other JavaScript include with your JavaScript include. Check the client lib site.js file. Client lib site.js file. These two client libraries are available in the same location. These two client libraries are available in the same location, apps, news portal, client libs. But if you see the path here, this client library start with /etc.client libs. But our client library included with apps. But this is the right location. This is the right location because all our client libraries are available under apps, news portal, client libs. But this is loading with a different path. But this is a recommended path to load all our client libraries. In our local, it will work because we don't have any dispatcher or we don't have any CDN for content caching and filtering purpose. When you send the request, directly request go to the publish server. But in the remote server, when you send a request from the browser, first it will go to CDN to dispatcher to publisher. If any path start with /apps, due to some security reasons, this dispatcher will block the request. Dispatcher will block the request. So that's why we should not load any URL with /apps. We have to bypass or we have to rename /apps with /etc.clientlibs. /apps with /etc.clientlibs. So there is one more property called allow proxy property. Allow proxy property. Add that property in your client library. So you will find out that property in other client libraries also. Click on client library base So allow proxy is a Boolean property, value is true. It will be useful to convert your app's URL into etc.clientlib URL. Basically, it will convert your app's URL into etc.clientlib URL. Copy the property, click on clientlib open desktop and paste here and save the changes. Now check the source code again. Our CSS file also start with etc client name, etc client name, and JavaScript file also load this etc client. So this is the recommended path to load all the CSS files and JavaScript files. CSS files and JavaScript files. There are two more properties in the client library. So far we discussed about two properties, right? One is categories. Categories is a mandatory property. Mandatory property, it will be useful to identify the client library. With the help of this client, with the help of these categories only, we can load the client libraries into the HTML markup. Categories is one important property. And second property is allow proxy. Second property is allow proxy. It will be useful to convert apps URL into etc.clientlibs. etc.clientlibs. And third property is dependencies properties. Dependencies property. And fourth property is embed property. Embed property. Dependencies and embed. You will find out these two properties in the existing client libraries also. You don't need to remember all the client library property name. You will find out all the properties in the existing client libraries. Click on client library and paste. The embed properties available. Click on dependencies. Click on sites. Yeah, dependencies properties available. You will find out all the properties from the existing client libs also. Existing client libs also. That what is the use of these dependencies and embed? What is the use of these dependencies and embed? So this dependencies property will be useful to create dependency between two client libraries. Let's say I have two client libraries. One is clientlib-desktop and second one is clientlib-jQuery. Clientlib-jQuery. Let's say my desktop is depending on jQuery. jQuery is one of the JavaScript library. In my JavaScript, I'm using this jQuery JavaScript methods. So that means the desktop is depending on jQuery. Desktop is depending on jQuery. So while loading this jQuery and desktop in our HTML markup, first we have to load clientlib-jQuery and then followed by clientlib-desktop. Let's say if you load clientlib-desktop first, while executing clientlib-desktop, it will try to execute jQuery methods. But at that moment, jQuery methods are not loaded. Not loaded. It will return error. So that's why if there is any dependency, these libraries we should load first, then followed by desktop. Desktop. If you are implementing static website, you have to take care of this dependency management manually. Manually, we have to take care of this dependency management. But in AEM, we can define the dependency by using dependencies property. By using dependencies property. First, check the category values. Category values of clientlib-desktop is newsportal.desktop. This category value is very important. It will be useful to load the client libraries into HTML markup, as well as it will be useful to define embed property, embed and dependencies properties. Category value of clientlib-desktop is newsportal.desktop. Category value of clientlib-jQuery is jQuery. This value we have to mention in the dependencies property. In the dependencies property. Don't mention the folder name or client library name. Don't use this name. Use this category value name in the dependencies property. If you follow this approach, if you add the dependencies property in the client web and desktop, here the value is category value of client web and jQuery. Without mentioning this jQuery in template level policy, it will load into the HTML markup. This client web and jQuery will load into HTML markup without mentioning this category value in template level page policy. We don't need to mention the jQuery category value in template level page policy. Without mentioning also, it will load into the HTML markup because of this dependencies property. My desktop is depending on jQuery. I have defined that by using dependencies property. Value is jQuery. Let's implement this one. Simply copy paste the client lib and desktop and create jQuery. Copy paste the client library rather than creating from the scratch. Copy paste and update the properties. News portal jQuery or jQuery. Save the changes and remove the CSS from this jQuery client library. CSS is not required here. Save the changes and add only one file, jQuery.js file. This is the library. Done. So I have created a simple client library for the jQuery. Client lib in jQuery. Type is CQ client library folder. Category value is newsportal.jQuery and allow proxy true. I have added required properties and added JS folder. Inside the JS folder, one file is generated, jQuery.js, and add one property for testing purpose where lib type equals jQuery and mention that file name js.txt. So this is the simple library. This client library have created for jQuery. Now this jQuery and desktop both are two independent client libraries. And if you want to create a relationship or if you want to create a dependencies, add dependencies properties in client lib and desktop. Add dependencies property in client lib and desktop because desktop is depending on jQuery. So we have to add that property in desktop. Add dependencies property. Dependencies. Type is string. Type is not string. This is string array. If you want to create a string array, select multi. Select multi and click on add. And mention the category name of client lib and jQuery. Newsportal.jQuery. Save the changes. So I have added dependencies between desktop and jQuery. In this case, desktop is depending on jQuery because I have added dependencies properties in desktop and value is newsportal jQuery. This is the value, this is the category value of client lib and jQuery. Now go to the source code and refresh it once and search with desktop. Search with desktop. Client lib and desktop. So before client lib and desktop, client lib and jQuery should load, but here it is not loading because we don't have the CSS implementation in client lib and jQuery. That's why before client lib and desktop, jQuery.css file is not. Click on next. Check here. Before client lib and desktop, jQuery.js is loaded because of the dependency management. because of the dependency management. Even we can create multiple levels of dependency management. Let's say I have three different client libraries. Desktop is one library, jQuery is one more library, and let me create one more Slick client library. Slick is one more client library. Save the changes. Update this category value also. Save the changes. Total three client libraries are created. First one is desktop. Desktop category values news portal desktop. And second one is Slick. And category values news portal Slick. And third one is jQuery. And category values news portal.jQuery. Total three client libraries are created. And added the dependency. This desktop is depending on Slick. And the Slick is depending on jQuery. Slick is depending on jQuery. Desktop is depending on Slick and Slick is depending on jQuery. Check the dependency property here. Check the dependencies property here. In the dependencies property, I have given category value of Slick because desktop is depending on Slick. And Slick is depending on jQuery. Check the dependencies properties of client lib-slick. The value is jQuery category value. Category value. So this is multi-level dependencies. Desktop is depending on Slick and Slick is depending on jQuery. jQuery. And now if you check this hierarchy, so this is the order of JavaScript includes in HTML mark. So before desktop, Slick will load. And before Slick, jQuery will load. jQuery will load. But we did not load these two libraries from the template level page policy. We are loading client lib desktop only. We are loading client lib desktop from template level page policy. But still these two client libraries will load because of this dependency management. So this is one of the certification question. This is one of the certification question. So these two files also will include because of this multi-level dependencies. Client lib-desktop is depending on Slick and Slick is depending on jQuery. Let's implement multi-level dependencies, the dependencies property. Copy this property and add into Slick. And click on client lib-desktop, update this value. Save. Now client lib-desktop is depending on Slick. Client lib-desktop is depending on Slick. And this Slick is depending on jQuery. Slick is depending on jQuery. Now refresh it once and check the JavaScript includes. Desktop, Slick, and jQuery. But we did not load these two client libraries from the template level page policy, but still loading because we are loading client lib and desktop. Desktop is depending on Slick. Slick is depending on jQuery. Because of this multi-level dependencies, other libraries also load. Other libraries also load. So this is called a dependencies property, and this property will be useful for the dependency management purpose. dependency management purpose. Desktop.js, and before desktop.js, slick.js, and slick before slick.js and jQuery.js. So these three files will load one by one. First jQuery.js, slick.js, and desktop.js. But there is one disadvantage with these dependencies. It will increase the number of requests for the JavaScript files. So there are three different inputs for this libraries. Let's say jQuery.js file size is 30 KB and slick file size is 50 KB and desktop size maybe 40 KB. So there are three different files. The size of this files is 30 KB and this is 50 and this is 40 KB. Three different files are loaded. But the disadvantage with this approach, three different requests will trigger from browser to server to download these files. Here the number of requests are increased. It will affect on the page speed. It will affect on the page speed. So in this case, dependencies is not recommended. Dependencies are not recommended. Use embed property. If you use embed property, all these three client libraries again merged into single client library. If you use embed, all these three client libraries again merged into a single client library. So for example, desktop.js, the desktop.js, instead of dependencies, if I use embed property, in the embed property, if I mention jQuery and slick.js, it will combine all the three libraries. It will combine all three libraries and generate a single file with the desktop.js. But if you open this JS, in the same order, the content of the jQuery.js and slick.js and desktop.js will be displayed. So these three files data will be displayed in desktop.js. So in this case, this is the recommended, because if you combine these three, the file size would be around 120 KB. 120 KB means that is fine. That is fine. But there is one scenario. In that scenario, we should not embed. For example, jQuery file size is 200 KB and Slick's file size is 500 KB and desktop file size is maybe 100 KB. In this case, if we combine these three files, the file size will be around 800 KB. So 800 KB of data, it will be take a lot of time to download from server to browser. It will impact on performance. So based on the file sizes, we have to decide whether we need to use embed property or dependencies property. Embed property we have to use if the file sizes are less. If the file sizes are less, we can use embed property and we can combine all these three files and generate a single file with the name of client lab. If file sizes are used, use dependencies. If you use dependencies, these individual files will load from server and these individual files will be executed in the browser. So both can be useful for the dependency management, both dependencies and embed. If you use dependencies, individual files will load. If you use embed, again these files will merge and generate a single file, and the single file will be loaded into the browser. So this is the dependencies. This is the difference between embed and dependency. This is one of the popular interview question. What is the difference between dependencies and embed? Both can be used for the dependency management purpose. If you use dependency, individual client library files will load. If you use embed, the client libraries again merged and generate a single file. So this entire three client libraries are merged and generate a single file. Let's test this fourth scenario. Desktop, remove the dependencies and use embed embed news portal dot jQuery news portal dot slick. Save the changes. Save the changes. Embed and categories. Now refresh source code of article 1. The single file is included. Single file is included and open the source code of the single file. The first one is jQuery library. Only one statement we have added, and Slick library code is added. Only one statement is added, and the remaining code is desktop.js. These three files are combined. jQuery.js and Slick.js and desktop.js, all three files, three client libraries are combined and generated a single file with the name of the client. It will reduce the number of files includes in HTML markup. But embed is not recommended if the file sizes are huge. If the file sizes are huge, embed is not recommended. Dependencies is recommended. If file sizes are less, we can embed. We can embed, and generate a single file. So these are the four different properties of the client libraries. Any questions in these four properties or client library? Any questions?